In 1845, a train with no engine reached 60 miles per hour. No smoke, no fire, no locomotive, just passenger carriages gliding silently through the English countryside at speeds that would not be matched for decades. This was not a prototype, not a laboratory experiment. This was a commercial railway carrying paying passengers on a daily schedule. And within 3 years, it was completely destroyed. Every trace systematically eliminated. Welcome to the Secret X-Files. Subscribe now, because what you are about to learn will change how you see Victorian technology forever. The technology was called the atmospheric railway, and its story is one of the strangest mysteries in industrial history. Picture London in the 1840s. The railway age has exploded across Britain. Steam locomotives belch black smoke across the countryside. Boiler explosions kill passengers with disturbing regularity. Coal dust covers everything within miles of the tracks. Railway workers develop lung diseases. Children living near the lines breathe air thick with particulates. The noise is overwhelming. The rhythmic chugging of steam pistons, the hiss of escaping pressure, the screech of metal on metal. Passengers shout to be heard over the mechanical roar. Railway travel is revolutionary, yes. It is shrinking distances and transforming commerce, but it is also dangerous, dirty, and deafening. Passengers arrive at their destinations covered in soot, their clothing ruined, their ears ringing. Sometimes mourning fellow travelers killed in boiler explosions or derailments. The statistics are grim. Between 1840 and 1850, hundreds of passengers died in railway accidents, boiler explosions, derailments, collisions. Death was a real possibility every time you bought a ticket. This was the state of transportation technology. This was the future everyone expected to continue. And then, suddenly, an alternative appeared. A train that ran on nothing but air. No locomotive, no fire, no fuel on the train at all. Just the natural weight of the atmosphere, harnessed through clever engineering. Passengers boarded carriages with no engine attached. The train began moving silently, smoothly. No jerking start, no building of steam pressure. Just immediate, steady acceleration. They could read books without the pages shaking. They could have conversations at normal volume. They could breathe clean air throughout their journey. They arrived at their destinations without soot on their clothing, without ringing ears, without the exhaustion that steam railway travel imposed. This technology actually existed. It actually worked. Thousands of passengers actually experienced it and documented their amazement in letters and newspaper accounts. Speed tests demonstrated capabilities that steam railways would not match for years. Safety records that steam could not approach. Passenger satisfaction that no contemporary railway could equal. So why have you never heard of it? Why is this technology not in your history books? Why do documentaries about Victorian engineering skip over it entirely? The official story says it failed, that Victorian engineers overreached, that the technology was fundamentally flawed and could never work reliably. But the evidence tells a very different story, a story of deliberate suppression, of powerful interest threatened by clean technology, and possibly something even stranger. By the end of this documentary, you will understand why the trains that ran on air were really destroyed. And you may never look at technology history the same way again. Let us begin with what we know for certain. the documented, verifiable facts that no historian disputes. The atmospheric railway was real. This is not legend or speculation. Engineering records survive in archives across Europe. Passenger accounts fill Victorian newspapers. Physical evidence still exists in the landscape today. The principle had been understood since the 17th century. Scientists knew that atmospheric pressure, the weight of the air above us, could be used to move objects through sealed tubes. Otto von Guericke demonstrated the power of atmospheric pressure in 1654 with his famous Magdeburg Hemispheres experiment. Two teams of horses could not pull apart two metal hemispheres with vacuum inside. The force was immense. 15 pounds per square inch across a large surface adds up to thousands of pounds of total force, enough to move heavy objects, enough to pull a train. But making it practical for passenger transport required solving significant engineering challenges: sealing the tubes, maintaining vacuum over long distances, connecting moving trains to stationary infrastructure. The Victorians claim to have solved these problems, and the evidence shows they actually did. The first commercial atmospheric railway opened in Ireland in 1844. The Dalkey line ran along the beautiful coast south of Dublin. The route presented a challenge that made it perfect for testing: a steep gradient climbing from the harbor at Kingstown to the hilltop town of Dalkey, a gradient that would strain any steam locomotive of the era. The atmospheric system handled the climb without effort. Carriages glided upward as smoothly as they traveled on level ground. The force was constant, regardless of incline. Passengers marveled at the experience: the silence, the smoothness, the clean air, the views of the Irish coastline undimmed by locomotive smoke. Contemporary accounts describe the wonder. Passengers who had endured the noise and dirt of steam railways suddenly experiencing something completely different. One observer wrote that it was like being carried by invisible hands. No apparent effort, no mechanical struggle, just smooth, silent motion through the landscape. The Dalkey line was not a brief experiment. It operated successfully for over 10 years, not months, over a decade of reliable, daily service carrying paying passengers. Visitors came from across Europe specifically to experience this marvel. Engineers came to study the technology. Investors came to evaluate the opportunity. Journalists came to report on the sensation. The silent train became a tourist attraction in itself, proof that a better way of traveling was not just possible, but actually existed and actually worked. In England, the London and Croydon Railway adopted atmospheric propulsion for their suburban extension through the growing southern districts of the metropolis. This was not a small experimental operation. This was a major railway company choosing this technology for regular commercial passenger service. Real money, real commitment, real confidence. Trains ran through the expanding suburbs, demonstrating that atmospheric propulsion could work in urban environments where steam railway smoke was already becoming a serious public nuisance. The success attracted attention throughout the railway industry. This was not fringe technology being pursued by eccentrics. This was serious engineering being seriously considered by serious investors. And then came Brunel. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the name that changes everything. If you know anything about Victorian engineering, you know Brunel. Perhaps the most celebrated engineer of the 19th century. Perhaps the most celebrated engineer in British history. He built the Great Western Railway, connecting London to Bristol and beyond. He designed the SS Great Britain, the largest ship in the world when it launched. He created the Clifton Suspension Bridge, still standing and still carrying traffic today. Brunel was not a man who backed losing technologies. His track record was extraordinary. His engineering judgment was trusted by investors, by governments, by the public. When Brunel chose a technology, the world paid attention. His endorsement was worth more than any advertising campaign. Brunel chose atmospheric propulsion for his South Devon Railway. The coastal route from Exeter toward Plymouth presented challenges that made atmospheric technology especially attractive. Steep gradients along the cliff sides, tight curves following the coastline, the scenic route that tourists would pay premium fares to experience, if only the journey could be made pleasant. Steam locomotives struggled on such routes. The grades required banking engines. The curves limited speeds. The smoke spoiled the views that passengers were paying to see. Atmospheric propulsion promised to solve all these problems. Constant force regardless of gradient. Smooth curves without the jerking of steam pistons. Clean air letting passengers actually enjoy the scenery. Brunel's design was the most ambitious yet. Larger tube diameter than previous implementations, generating more force. Longer sections between pumping stations. Higher target speeds than any atmospheric railway had achieved. Brunel was not hedging his bets. He was not conducting a cautious experiment. He was going all in on atmospheric technology, staking his formidable reputation on its success. The pumping stations he specified were substantial structures, Italianate towers rising along the Devon coast, designed by skilled architects to be aesthetically pleasing as well as functional. These were not cheap temporary buildings for a doubtful experiment. This was permanent infrastructure intended for decades of service. Architecture expressing confidence in the technology it would house. One pumping station still stands at Starcross on the Exe estuary. Nearly 2 centuries later, its distinctive tower still rises above the water. Physical evidence of ambitions that once seemed destined to transform transportation. Construction proceeded rapidly. The first atmospheric section opened in September 1847. Operations began with immediate success. Trains ran on schedule. Passengers rode in previously unknown comfort. Speed tests exceeded all expectations. Contemporary accounts describe the experience in terms that seem almost unbelievable to modern readers, accustomed to the compromises of train travel. Speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour in an era when most steam trains struggled to reach 40. Acceleration so smooth that standing passengers did not need to brace themselves. Rides so quiet that normal conversation was possible throughout the journey. No shouting over engine noise. No competition with the rhythmic pounding of steam pistons. The safety record was perfect. 0 passenger deaths during the entire operational period. Compare this to steam railways of the same era, where boiler explosions and derailments killed with disturbing regularity. For those months in 1847 and early 1848, the future of transportation seemed clear. Atmospheric propulsion would spread across the railway network. Silent, clean, efficient travel for everyone. Now let us understand exactly how this remarkable technology actually worked. The engineering is elegant in its fundamental simplicity. We live at the bottom of an ocean of air. The atmosphere stretches miles above us, and all that air has weight. This weight presses down on everything at the surface. At sea level, Atmospheric pressure amounts to about 15 pounds on every square inch of surface. This force exists everywhere, constantly, without any fuel required to generate it. 15 pounds per square inch does not sound like much, but consider a surface of 100 square inches. That is 1,500 pounds of force. A tube 1 foot in diameter experiences over 2,500 pounds of pushing force. The atmospheric railway harnessed this natural force through clever engineering. A cast iron tube, typically about 15 inches in diameter, ran between the rails along the entire length of the track. This tube was the heart of the system. Pumping stations at intervals along the line used steam engines to drive air pumps. These pumps evacuated sections of the tube, creating partial vacuum inside. With reduced pressure inside the tube and full atmospheric pressure outside, a pressure differential was created. This differential generated enormous pushing force. A piston fitted snugly inside the tube was pushed by this force. Push from behind, pull from the vacuum ahead. Thousands of pounds of force propelling the piston through the tube. The train above was connected to this piston through a slot running along the top of the tube. As the piston moved, the train moved with it. The connection between piston and train was made through a continuous slot covered by a leather flap. This valve was the ingenious solution to a difficult problem. The slot allowed the connecting arm to pass through, but the leather flap sealed the opening to maintain vacuum. Atmospheric pressure itself held the flap closed against the tube. As the piston approached any section, a blade at the front lifted the flap just enough for the connecting arm to pass. Behind it, rollers pressed the flap back down, resealing before significant air could enter. Tallow, a form of rendered animal fat, was applied to the leather to keep it supple and help maintain the seal. With proper maintenance, the system worked smoothly. The pumping stations were engineering achievements in themselves. Large beam engines drove air pumps, capable of evacuating significant tube sections quickly. Coordination between stations was essential. As a train approached, the station ahead would begin pumping, creating the vacuum that would pull the train forward, a ballet of pressure and timing. The power generation was centralized and efficient. One large pumping station engine, operating at optimal conditions, could serve multiple trains passing through its section. Compare this to steam locomotives, where every train carried its own inefficient small engine, burning fuel under constantly varying conditions. The atmospheric approach made thermodynamic sense. The train itself carried no engine, no fire, no fuel. Just passenger carriages and the connecting arm to the piston below. The simplicity was profound. Without heavy locomotives weighing many tons, the entire system could be lighter. Tracks could use lighter rails. Bridges could use lighter construction. The infrastructure costs dropped. Without fire on the trains, there was no risk of trackside fires from locomotive sparks. Victorian railways regularly set fire to fields, forests, and buildings along their routes. Atmospheric railways eliminated this hazard. Without boilers on the trains, there was no risk of the explosions that killed so many steam railway passengers. The most dangerous component was in the pumping station, away from travelers. Without coal burning on the trains, there was no smoke filling carriages, no soot settling on passengers, no respiratory assault from hours spent breathing locomotive exhaust. The gradient climbing ability was remarkable and counterintuitive to those accustomed to steam. Steam locomotives depended on wheel friction to transmit power. The driving wheels gripped the rails, pushing the train forward. On steep grades, wheels could slip, limiting the inclines that could be climbed. The atmospheric piston had no such limitation. It was pushed by pressure differential, regardless of the angle of the tube. The force remained constant whether level or climbing steeply. Mountains, cliffsides, steep terrain all became accessible without special gearing, without rack and pinion systems, without banking engines. The technology opened possibilities that steam could not match. This was why the technology was so attractive for challenging routes like the Devon coast. The steep grades that challenged steam locomotives presented no obstacle to atmospheric propulsion. And the passenger experience was transformed in ways that contemporary accounts struggle to convey, because the improvement was so complete. Now here is the official story, the narrative that historians have repeated for nearly 2 centuries, the explanation you will find in every textbook that mentions atmospheric railways at all. The atmospheric railway failed because of one component, the leather valve that sealed the propulsion tube. The summer of 1847 was unusually hot. The sun beat down on the exposed tube running between the rails. The leather dried out faster than the designers had anticipated. Cracks appeared in the material, small at first but growing. Each crack allowed air to leak into the tube. The carefully maintained vacuum began to degrade. More pumping was required to maintain adequate pressure differential. The pumping stations worked harder. Fuel consumption increased. Costs escalated beyond projections. Then came the rats. Rats were attracted to the tallow used to keep the leather supple. The animal fat was food to them. They gnawed at the material, creating holes that no amount of maintenance could keep up with. The damage accelerated through the summer. Heat damage combined with rat attacks. Maintenance crews worked frantically to replace leather sections, but they could not keep pace. By autumn, the situation was critical. Performance had degraded below acceptable levels. Costs had escalated beyond the railway company's ability to sustain. Shareholders were demanding answers. Brunel, the engineering genius who had championed the technology, conducted a thorough assessment. His conclusion was devastating. The problems could not be solved economically. He recommended abandonment. The railway company's board accepted his recommendation. The decision was made. The atmospheric system would be replaced with conventional steam locomotives. The infrastructure was dismantled with remarkable speed. Tubes removed from between the rails and sold for scrap metal. Pumping station equipment auctioned to the highest bidders. Within months, the physical evidence of atmospheric operation was largely erased. The railway continued operating, but now with smoke-belching steam locomotives like every other line. The atmospheric experiment was over. The investment was written off. The technology was abandoned. Within a generation, the atmospheric railway became a cautionary tale. A footnote about Victorian overreach, an example of engineering ambition exceeding practical reality. History books, when they mention atmospheric railways at all, present them as failed experiments, interesting dead ends, lessons in the limits of innovation, proof that not every clever idea actually works. That is the official story, and parts of it are indisputably true. The leather valve did have problems. The summer was genuinely hot. The rats were definitely real. The costs did escalate. These facts are documented. But is that the complete story? Or is it a convenient narrative that obscures more than it reveals? Let us look more closely at the evidence, because several crucial facts simply do not fit the official explanation. Here is where this story gets really interesting. Let us examine the official narrative with the critical attention it deserves, because several facts simply do not add up. First, and most obviously, the problems were solvable. Simple iron mesh could have protected the leather from rats. This was not advanced technology requiring years of development. Wire mesh existed. Metal screens existed. The solution was obvious and immediately available. The Victorians knew how to keep rats away from things. They had been doing it for centuries. Granaries, food stores, ships. The technology of rat-proofing was well established. Why was this obvious solution not implemented? Why was no serious effort made to protect the valve from the rodent damage everyone could see occurring? Different treatments or alternative materials might have addressed the heat problems. Treated canvas, different lubricants, metal components. The engineering options were not exhausted. The Dalkey line in Ireland operated for over 10 years through multiple summers without catastrophic failure. The Irish climate is cooler than Devon, but not dramatically so. The technology could work reliably. The South Devon abandonment came after less than a year of full operation. One difficult summer, one challenging season. Less than 12 months of service. A single bad summer was used to condemn an entire technological approach. Does that seem proportionate to you? Every new technology faces initial problems. Solutions are developed, improvements are made. The technology matures. This is normal engineering development. But atmospheric railways were given no time to mature. One summer of problems, and the entire approach was abandoned forever. Second, compare this to how steam technology was treated. The double standard is striking. Early steam locomotives were genuinely dangerous machines. Boilers exploded with terrifying regularity. The pressure vessels were often poorly constructed. Safety valves failed. Engineers were killed. Passengers were killed. The death toll from steam railway accidents in the 1840s was substantial. Hundreds of people died. Families were destroyed. The risks were well documented and widely known. The Locomotive Act of 1865, passed 2 decades after atmospheric railways were abandoned, still reflected ongoing safety concerns about steam technology. The problems persisted for years. Did anyone suggest abandoning steam railways because they killed people? Did investors pull their money? Did engineers recommend scrapping the entire approach? No, the technology was given time to mature. Investment continued. Safety improvements were developed. Better boilers were designed. Operating procedures were refined. Solutions were found. Steam railways had decades of lethal accidents before they became relatively safe. They killed people every year and continued to receive support and investment. Atmospheric railways killed nobody and were destroyed within months. The asymmetry is striking. It is impossible to ignore once you notice it. Steam technology that killed passengers received continued support and patient improvement. Atmospheric technology that killed no one was eliminated rapidly and completely. Why the double standard? What explains this remarkable difference in treatment? Third, and this is crucial, consider who benefited from atmospheric railway failure. Coal was the foundation of the entire Victorian industrial economy. Mining employed hundreds of thousands of workers directly. Transportation of coal was itself a major industry. The economic structure of Britain depended on coal consumption continuing to grow. Every new factory needed coal. Every new steam engine needed coal. Every new mile of railway track meant expanded coal demand. Railways and coal mining were completely intertwined. Railway companies transported coal. Coal fueled railway locomotives. The industries grew together, each feeding the other's expansion. Atmospheric railways threatened this relationship directly and fundamentally. Trains that burned no coal during their journeys. Rolling stock that required no fuel supply. Operations that did not depend on continuous coal delivery. And it got worse for coal interests. The pumping stations could potentially be powered by alternatives. Water wheels where rivers were available. Wind power in suitable locations. Even horse-powered treadmills if necessary. The atmospheric railway represented a technological path that could reduce coal dependence. A future where transportation did not require the black mineral. An existential threat to a major industry. Coal mine owners had obvious and substantial interest in atmospheric failure. Less railway coal consumption meant less demand for their product. Lower demand meant lower prices. Lower prices meant lower profits. Steam locomotive manufacturers had invested heavily in their expertise, their factories, their supply chains. They had developed specialized skills and expensive equipment over decades. Atmospheric railways needed no locomotives at all. Zero. The entire locomotive manufacturing industry would become unnecessary if atmospheric technology spread. Think about that. Every locomotive works. Every foundry casting engine parts. Every skilled worker building steam engines. All of it threatened with obsolescence. Existing railway companies had committed to steam infrastructure. They owned fleets of locomotives representing enormous capital investment. They had built maintenance facilities. They had trained staff in steam technology. Conversion to atmospheric would mean abandoning all that accumulated investment, writing off expensive equipment, retraining workers or letting them go, starting over with entirely new systems. Every railway company running steam had financial interest in atmospheric failure. Success of the new technology would devalue everything they had built. These interests did not need to meet in secret rooms and plot together. They did not need formal conspiracy. They simply needed to pursue their individual advantages through normal business and political channels. The alignment against atmospheric technology was structural, built into the economic relationships of Victorian industry, automatic, pervasive, powerful. When problems appeared with the atmospheric valve, these interests had every reason to amplify concerns rather than support solutions. Why would coal suppliers fund research to improve atmospheric seals? Why would locomotive manufacturers invest in technology that would eliminate their markets? The incentives all pointed toward failure, toward emphasizing problems, toward discouraging continued development, toward ensuring the technology never got a fair chance. The speed of the narrative shift is suspicious when examined closely. One difficult summer became permanent and total condemnation of the entire approach. No extended period of problem solving, no second chances, no serious attempt to address the engineering challenges. Compare this to any other Victorian engineering challenge. Bridge collapses led to improved bridge design, not abandonment of bridges. Ship sinkings led to better ships, not abandonment of shipping. Tunnel failures led to better tunneling methods. building collapses led to improved construction. In every other field, problems led to solutions. Failures led to learning. But atmospheric railways had one bad summer and were completely destroyed. The technology was not improved. It was eliminated. The verdict arrived remarkably fast, as if it had been waiting for an excuse, as if the conclusion had been determined before the evidence was fully examined. Brunel's silence after abandonment is extraordinary and revealing. After the conversion to steam, Brunel never spoke publicly about atmospheric railways again. Not one word in defense, not one explanation, not one suggestion that the problems might eventually be solved. This is completely out of character. Brunel was not a modest man. He defended his decisions vigorously throughout his career. He argued publicly for his engineering choices, sometimes for years. The broad-gauge railway controversy saw Brunel defending his wider track standard against critics for decades. He never backed down. He never admitted error. He fought to his dying day. But on atmospheric railways, complete and total silence. The greatest engineer of his era said absolutely nothing to defend or explain the technology he had championed so strongly. Why? Was it simply embarrassment? The pain of a rare failure for a man accustomed to success after success? Or did Brunel understand something about why the technology was really abandoned? Something he could not say publicly. Some battle he knew could not be won, regardless of engineering merit. The infrastructure dismantling was remarkably thorough and swift. Tubes removed from between the rails and sold for scrap within weeks. Equipment dispersed to buyers across the country. Records scattered across different institutions. Physical evidence largely erased. Why such haste? The railway was still operating with steam. The tubes between the rails were not in the way. The pumping station buildings still stood. What was the rush to eliminate everything? If this was simply a failed experiment, why not preserve some infrastructure for study? Why not keep samples and documents for future engineers who might solve the problems? Failed experiments are usually documented carefully. Lessons learned are recorded for posterity. Materials are preserved in museums and archives for future reference. But the atmospheric railway was eliminated with unusual thoroughness, as if someone wanted to ensure it could not easily be revived, as if the goal was erasure rather than documentation. The thoroughness suggests something more than mere business decision. It suggests deliberate elimination of possibility. Fourth, and critically important for understanding the full picture, the external costs were never counted in the economic analysis. Victorian economic analysis compared the visible costs that investors face directly. Construction expenses, operating requirements, maintenance demands, fuel cost. The atmospheric railway appeared more expensive by some of these measures because its costs were visible and honestly counted in the ledgers. What the calculations did not include were the costs that steam railways imposed on everyone else. Costs that were real, but did not appear on any company's balance sheet. Smoke damage to property along railway routes. Buildings blackened by soot. Vegetation killed by emissions. Property values reduced for everyone living near the tracks. Health costs of pollution exposure. Respiratory illness among railway workers who breathed locomotive exhaust every day. Developmental effects on children living near the lines. Shortened lifespans that no one measured or compensated. Fire losses from locomotive sparks. Crops burned, buildings ignited, forests destroyed along railway corridors. Insurance claims that fell on property owners, not railway companies. Noise impacts on communities, sleep disruption for everyone living near the tracks, property devaluation, quality of life degradation, costs that were real but invisible in corporate accounting. None of these costs entered the economic analysis that determined atmospheric railway fate. They were externalized onto society, while the benefits were captured privately by shareholders. Modern economists call these externalities, costs imposed on parties who have no say in the decision and receive no compensation for the harm they suffer. The atmospheric railway would have avoided most of these external costs. No smoke damage, no fire risk from sparks, dramatically reduced noise, centralized emissions at pumping stations that could potentially be sited away from populated areas or powered by clean sources. If all costs had been counted honestly, atmospheric technology might have appeared economically superior. The total cost to society might have been lower, but the accounting was designed to favor the incumbent technology, to make steam look cheaper by ignoring the costs it imposed on others. The game was rigged from the start. Atmospheric railways were competing on an uneven field, held to cost standards that steam railways never faced, judged by criteria designed to ensure their failure while ignoring the failures of the alternative. But now we come to the deepest mystery. The question that pushes this story from industrial conspiracy into something far stranger and more unsettling. Did the Victorians actually invent the atmospheric railway? Or were they recovering something much older? This question sounds outlandish at first, but consider the evidence carefully before dismissing it. The atmospheric railway appeared remarkably fully formed in the 1840s, not as a gradual development over decades, but as a working system almost immediately. Multiple engineering teams in different countries produced working systems almost simultaneously. England, Ireland, France, all developing atmospheric railways at the same time. Samuel Clegg and Jacob Samuda in England, different engineers in Ireland, French teams working on their own implementations, all arriving at similar solutions in the same brief period. Normally, we can trace technological development through visible stages, decades of incremental advances, failed experiments leading to improved designs, a clear progression from concept to practical implementation. Steam engine development followed this pattern clearly. We can trace it from Thomas Newcomen's atmospheric engine in 1712, through James Watt's improvements, through Richard Trevithick's high-pressure designs, to the railway locomotives of the 1830s. Over a century of documented development, each engineer building on previous work, progress visible in the historical record. The atmospheric railway shows no such development arc. It seems to arrive nearly complete, requiring refinement and scaling rather than fundamental invention. How did multiple teams in different countries converge on working solutions so quickly? Almost as if they were all drawing on common knowledge that already existed somewhere. Parallel invention does happen occasionally in history, but usually when the underlying principles have been widely discussed and all the technical components are readily available. The atmospheric railway appeared too sophisticated too fast. The pumping station architecture is particularly striking and worth close examination. Look at photographs or drawings of the Star-Cross pumping station in Devon. Its distinctive Italianate tower still stands today, nearly 2 centuries after construction. This was not cheap temporary construction for an unproven experiment. This was substantial architecture, quality materials, sophisticated design, built with confidence that it would serve for generations. The star-crossed tower includes features that seem oddly advanced for experimental infrastructure. The proportions are elegant. The construction is substantial beyond necessity. The craftsmanship exceeds what testing facilities typically warrant. Why would engineers build such permanent structures for technology they were supposedly still proving? Why invest in beautiful architecture for an experiment? Unless they already knew it would work. Unless the buildings were not experiments, but implementations of principles already proven elsewhere. Some researchers have noticed something curious about Victorian industrial architecture more broadly. Certain buildings seem too sophisticated for their attributed construction dates, too permanent, too confident. Alternative historians have raised a provocative question. What if some of these structures actually predate their official construction dates in the historical record? What if Victorian engineers were not always building new infrastructure from scratch, but sometimes adapting, renovating, or repurposing structures that already existed? This connects to broader questions about the 19th century that conventional history struggles to explain satisfactorily. The speed of industrialization, the sophistication of early engineering, the consistent architectural styles that appeared across continents almost simultaneously, the standardization that seems to precede the organizations that supposedly created it. What if the Victorians were not inventing entirely from scratch, but recovering knowledge from an earlier civilization that official history does not acknowledge? Consider the atmospheric railway within this framework. The evidence takes on different meaning. The immediate viability of commercial operation, the sophisticated engineering that appeared fully formed, the confidence expressed in permanent infrastructure, the simultaneous development across multiple countries. All of this fits more easily with recovery of existing knowledge than with sudden parallel invention from nothing. If the atmospheric railway represented recovered technology, the suppression narrative takes on darker significance. New experimental technology might be allowed to develop and fail naturally. Errors could be corrected over time. Improvements could be made incrementally. The technology would find its natural level in the marketplace. But recovered technology from a civilization that official history denies ever existed would be far more threatening to those controlling historical narrative. Proof that advanced technology existed before the accepted timeline. Evidence that challenges the story of continuous progress from primitive to advanced. A crack in the foundation of how we understand the past. If atmospheric railways represented such forbidden knowledge, the imperative to destroy them would extend far beyond mere commercial interest. It would not be enough for the technology to fail commercially. It would need to be thoroughly erased. Evidence eliminated. Knowledge scattered. The possibility removed from public imagination and historical memory. The thoroughness of atmospheric railway destruction fits this interpretation disturbingly well. Infrastructure removed with unusual speed, equipment dispersed, records scattered across multiple institutions, physical evidence largely eliminated within months of the abandonment decision. This was not the preservation you would expect for a failed but interesting experiment. This was systematic erasure, more consistent with something being hidden. The gaps in documentary records are curious and consistent with concealment. If the goal was genuine historical preservation, You would expect comprehensive documentation, engineering drawings carefully preserved, operational records maintained for future study, lessons learned systematically recorded. Instead, atmospheric railway documentation is fragmented and incomplete. Key records are missing. The historical trail goes cold at suspicious points. Information that should exist does not. This pattern makes more sense if the goal was obscuring origins rather than preserving history for posterity. Multiple engineering teams producing similar solutions simultaneously suggest common source rather than independent parallel invention. Different engineers in different countries arriving at essentially the same technology at essentially the same time, as if they were all reading from the same ancient manual, drawing from the same forgotten well of knowledge. We cannot prove this interpretation definitively with evidence that currently exists publicly. Evidence of earlier civilizations, if it ever existed in clear form, would likely have been eliminated long ago by those with interest in maintaining accepted historical narrative. What remains is pattern and anomaly, questions that the official narrative cannot answer satisfactorily, gaps that demand explanation. But the questions are worth asking. The official story has problems that conventional explanation cannot resolve. Whether the Victorian engineers were brilliant inventors creating something genuinely new, or careful recoverers rebuilding something ancient they had found records of, their practical achievement was real. The trains that ran on air actually ran. Passengers actually rode them. The technology actually worked for everyone who experienced it. That fact remains, regardless of how we interpret its ultimate origins. And it was destroyed, thoroughly, rapidly, completely. More thoroughly than mere business failure would require. The mystery is not only where the technology came from, it is why it was so determinedly erased from both physical existence and historical memory. Both questions deserve serious investigation. Both questions remain open. The story does not end with Victorian abandonment. The principles of atmospheric propulsion refuse to stay buried despite all efforts to eliminate them. Decades later, and an ocean away, a remarkable man named Alfred Ely Beach proved that the technology still worked. And his story adds another layer to this mystery. Beach was a fascinating figure who understood both technology and politics. Patent attorney, inventor, publisher of Scientific American magazine, one of the most respected technical publications in America. Beach wanted to build underground transit for New York City. He had observed the traffic congestion choking Manhattan streets, horse-drawn vehicles gridlocked, travel times increasing, the city strangling on its own success. He believed pneumatic propulsion was the solution. Clean underground transit, moving passengers beneath the congested streets. The same principles that had worked in Devon and Dublin applied to urban transportation. But Beach understood that powerful interest would oppose clean transit alternatives. The established transportation companies, the political machine that profited from existing arrangements, the forces that had destroyed atmospheric railways in Europe. So Alfred Ely Beach did something extraordinary. He built his demonstration railway in absolute secrecy. He obtained a permit for a small pneumatic tube to carry mail and packages, a minor project that attracted no opposition. Then he built something much larger. Unable to obtain permits openly for passenger transit, Beach constructed a full-size passenger-capable tunnel beneath Broadway, one of the busiest streets in America. Workers dug at night to avoid notice, Earth was removed through basement access points and carted away. A sophisticated boring shield, one of the first ever used, carved through the soil beneath the city. A complete demonstration system was built in silence. Tunnel, station, waiting room, pneumatic propulsion system, all constructed without the knowledge of the city government or the public. When Beech revealed his completed system in February 1870, it was a sensation. The newspapers covered it extensively. The public was amazed that such a project had been completed in secret. Thousands of visitors lined up to experience underground pneumatic travel. They paid 25 cents to ride through Beech's tunnel and emerged astonished at what they had experienced. Smooth, quiet travel, elegant surroundings, air that was actually cleaner underground than on the streets above. A demonstration that underground transit could be comfortable, safe, and even beautiful. The waiting room Beech constructed was not merely functional. It featured paintings on the walls, a fountain with goldfish, a grand piano. He wanted to prove that underground travel could be civilized. Beech sought permission to extend his system into a full transit network serving all of Manhattan. He had proven the concept worked. He had public support. He had a viable business plan. But the political machine of Boss Tweed controlled New York City at that time, and Tweed's associates had competing transportation interests they wanted to protect. Corrupt officials blocked Beech's proposals year after year. His applications for expansion were denied, delayed, buried in bureaucratic obstruction. The demonstration sat idle while permission was refused. Even after Tweed fell from power in the corruption scandals of 1871, opposition continued from other interests invested in alternative approaches to transit. Beech's pneumatic system threatened too many established players. Beech advocated for pneumatic transit until his death in 1896. 26 years of advocacy. He never saw his vision realized in his lifetime. Another innovator defeated by entrenched interests. His demonstration tunnel was eventually forgotten, sealed up as construction continued in Lower Manhattan, built over as the city grew upward and outward. Another possibility buried literally underground. The tunnel was accidentally rediscovered during subway construction in 1912. Workers broke through into Beech's elegant waiting room, still intact after more than 4 decades of abandonment. The fountain, the decorative elements, the physical evidence of what had been demonstrated and denied. A time capsule of suppressed possibility, discovered by astonished workers. New York eventually built its subway system using different technology. Electric trains running on conventional rails. Beech's pioneering work went unacknowledged. The atmospheric approach was not seriously considered. But here is the definitive proof that atmospheric principles actually worked. Proof that operated reliably, not for months or years, but for generations. The pneumatic postal systems. London's pneumatic dispatch began in 1863. During the same decade, the atmospheric railways were being destroyed. Capsules containing messages traveled through underground tubes, pushed by pressure differential. The technology was identical to atmospheric railways in principle. Create vacuum, use pressure differential to move objects through tubes. The same physics that supposedly could not work for passenger transport worked perfectly for mail. The London system connected post offices across the city. Messages that would take hours to deliver by messenger arrived in minutes. The technology proved itself daily. Paris built the most extensive pneumatic postal network in the world. Beginning in 1866, the system eventually included over 467 kilometers of tubes, connecting postal facilities, government offices, and major businesses across the city. The Paris Pneumatic Post operated continuously until 1984. Not until the development of electronic communication made physical message delivery obsolete was the system finally retired. Over a century of daily reliable service, 118 years of continuous operation, the technology that supposedly made atmospheric railways impossible worked perfectly for postal service across more than a century. New York installed a pneumatic mail system in 1897. It operated continuously until 1953. Over 50 years of reliable service delivering mail beneath Manhattan's streets. Philadelphia, Chicago, Boston, and other American cities built their own pneumatic networks. The technology spread across the industrialized world because it demonstrably worked. Identical principles to the atmospheric railway. Pressure differential, moving objects through tubes. The same physics, the same engineering approach, but different political context, different outcome. Pneumatic mail did not threaten locomotive manufacturers. It did not reduce coal consumption significantly. It served needs that existing powerful interests did not profit from serving themselves. Railways were abandoned within years despite working. Mail systems operated for generations because they threatened no one important. The difference was not in the engineering. The difference was whose economic and political interests were threatened. And now, in our own era, the principles have returned once again. The physics that worked in 1847 and 1870, and through a century of pneumatic mail, is being rediscovered. In 2013, Elon Musk released his Hyperloop white paper, proposing vehicles traveling through low-pressure tubes at speeds exceeding 700 miles per hour. The technical community immediately recognized what casual observers might have missed. This was the same fundamental principle Victorian engineers had demonstrated in the 1840s. Reduced air pressure enabling efficient transportation, less air resistance, less energy required, higher speeds possible. The atmospheric railway returning in 21st century form. Multiple companies have since invested billions of dollars in Hyperloop development. Virgin Hyperloop, Hyperloop Transportation Technologies, various startups pursuing variations on the theme. Test facilities have been built in Nevada, France, and elsewhere. Demonstrations have been conducted for investors and media. Test runs have achieved speeds exceeding 400 kilometers per hour in evacuated tubes. The physics works in 2024 exactly as it worked in 1847. Because physics does not change based on fashion or politics or the preferences of powerful interests. Whether Hyperloop will succeed commercially remains to be seen. The technology demonstrably works. The engineering challenges are being solved. The question is whether it will be permitted to develop. The Victorian precedent offers both hope and warning for modern observers. Hope because the technology demonstrably can work. The principles are sound. The physics is validated by both historical operation and modern testing. The engineering is feasible. Warning because technical success does not guarantee survival. The atmospheric railway proved that conclusively. Superior technology can be destroyed by inferior interests if those interests have sufficient power. The pattern that eliminated the trains that ran on air could operate again. Different actors, different era, similar dynamics, same ultimate result. Or this time could be different. Climate crisis has created urgency that Victorian decisions did not face. The environmental costs of fossil fuel dependence are now impossible to ignore or externalize. Perhaps the conditions of our era finally favor clean transportation alternatives. Perhaps the pattern established in the 1840s can finally be broken after nearly 2 centuries. The answer depends partly on whether enough people understand the history, recognize the patterns, resist the narratives that serve established interests over public benefit. Before we conclude, consider one final thought experiment. Imagine you are a Victorian investor in 1848. You have seen the atmospheric railway operate successfully. Passengers are delighted. The technology works. Now you receive reports of problems. The leather is deteriorating. Costs are rising. Experts recommend abandonment. What do? Do you fund solutions to fixable problems? Or do you accept the failure narrative and redirect your capital elsewhere? The answer depended on what other information you were receiving, what your advisors were telling you, what stories the newspapers were printing. If the information environment was shaped by interests hostile to atmospheric railways, your decision would be shaped accordingly. You would not feel manipulated. You would feel you were making rational decisions based on available evidence. The manipulation would be invisible. This is how suppression works in practice, not through force, but through information control, through shaping what seems reasonable. The Victorian investors who abandoned atmospheric railways were not stupid. They were responding rationally to an information environment that had been deliberately distorted. The same dynamic operates today. The same techniques shape public perception of clean technologies. The same interests benefit from confusion and doubt. Recognizing this pattern is the first step toward resisting it. When you understand how information environments are manipulated, you can seek alternative sources. You can ask who benefits from particular narratives. You can look for evidence that contradicts convenient conclusions. The atmospheric railway story is not just history. It is a case study in how transformative technology can be destroyed through information warfare. Learn from it, apply its lessons, and perhaps the next clean technology that threatens established interests will survive where atmospheric railways did not. So what have we learned from this investigation? The atmospheric railway was real. It worked. Passengers loved it. It was faster, cleaner, and safer than the steam alternative that replaced it. It was destroyed not because it failed on technical merits, but because it threatened interests too powerful to challenge openly in Victorian Britain. The official story of leather valves and rats is not entirely false. The facts it contains are accurate, but the narrative is incomplete and misleading, designed to justify a predetermined conclusion rather than explain what actually happened. The problems were solvable with available technology. The abandonment was a choice, not a necessity. The erasure was deliberate, not accidental. The speed of destruction suggests agenda rather than simple business decision. Whether the technology was Victorian invention or ancient recovery remains an open and fascinating question. The evidence suggests something more complex than official history admits. The sophisticated architecture, the suspicious speed of development, the parallel appearance across multiple countries, the thorough destruction. These details demand explanation that conventional narrative does not provide. The atmospheric railway represents a road not taken, a cleaner, quieter future that was technically possible in the 1840s and was deliberately prevented from developing. The environmental costs of that Victorian decision accumulated across nearly 2 centuries. The respiratory disease from coal pollution, the climate change from carbon emissions, the degraded quality of life for generations of people living near railways. The trajectory that leads to our current environmental crisis has roots in choices made about which technologies to permit and which to destroy. We are living with the consequences of decisions made before our great-great-grandparents were born. But the physics has not changed. The principles remain valid. The possibility is not closed, only delayed by nearly 200 years of suppression and forgetting. Hyperloop and similar technologies may finally break the pattern, or they may encounter the same opposition that destroyed their Victorian predecessor. The outcome is not predetermined. The lesson of the atmospheric railway is profound and still relevant today. Technology alone does not determine the future. Politics matters. Economic interests matter. The stories we tell about what is possible and impossible matter. If you understand this history, you can recognize the same patterns operating in the present day. Clean energy technologies facing skepticism and opposition that fossil fuels never encountered when they were new. Electric vehicles held to standards that combustion engines were never required to meet. Renewable power sources attacked for intermittency, while the environmental costs of baseline fossil plants are ignored or externalized onto communities that have no voice in the decisions. The tactics that worked in the 1840s are still being deployed today. The narratives of impossibility, the emphasis on problems, the double standards, the rigged economic comparisons. The question is whether enough people will recognize these patterns in time to resist them effectively. The trains that ran on air are calling across the centuries. They remind us that better alternatives have existed before and been destroyed. That suppression of clean technology is not new or unprecedented. That the game is not always played fairly or honestly. That what we accept as historical failure may actually be deliberate destruction by interests that profited from dirtier alternatives. What you do with this knowledge is up to you. Share this video if it changed how you understand Victorian technology and the forces that shape which innovations succeed. Subscribe for more hidden histories that challenge official narratives. Hit the notification bell so you will not miss what we uncover next. These stories are not told in mainstream documentaries for reasons that should now be obvious. The atmospheric railway waited nearly 2 centuries for its story to be told properly. Now you know what really happened to the trains that ran on air. Until next time, keep questioning, keep investigating, keep looking beneath the surface of accepted history. The truth is out there, buried beneath layers of convenient narrative, waiting to be discovered by those willing to look. This has been The Secret X-Files. Thanks for watching. Let us examine the Dalkey atmospheric railway more closely, because its decade of successful operation directly contradicts the failure narrative. The Dalkey line opened on March 19, 1844. It ran from Kingstown, now Dunleary, to Dalkey along the Irish coast south of Dublin. The route was only 1 3/4 miles long, but it climbed a gradient of 1 in 115, rising from sea level to the hilltop town. a genuine engineering challenge. Steam locomotives of the era struggled with such gradients. Wheels slipped on steep inclines. Power output dropped as angles increased. The Dalkey climb would have required special arrangements for steam operation. The atmospheric system handled it effortlessly. The pressure differential pulling the piston remained constant regardless of gradient. Hills simply did not matter. Trains made the ascent in 3.5 minutes, considerably faster than horses could have managed, faster than early steam locomotives would have achieved on such a gradient. The descent was managed by gravity and braking. Trains simply rolled back down to Kingstown, controlled by conventional brakes. No power required in either direction relative to the train itself. Passenger reaction was overwhelmingly positive. The newspapers of the era contain numerous accounts praising the smoothness, the speed, the novelty of the experience. The line operated profitably for over a decade, not as a money-losing experiment, but as a functioning commercial railway that covered its costs and satisfied its customers. When it was finally closed in 1854, the closure was not due to technical failure. It was a business decision related to the extension of the Dublin and Kingstown Railway, which absorbed the atmospheric line. 10 years, through Irish winters and summers, through rain and wind and occasional snow, the Dalkey Atmospheric Railway operated without the catastrophic failures that supposedly doomed the South Devon line. Why did Dalkey succeed where South Devon supposedly failed? Perhaps the Dalkey line was simply too small to threaten major interests, a short tourist attraction rather than a model for network-wide adoption. Isambard Kingdom Brunel deserves closer examination. Understanding the man helps us understand why his failure meant so much. Brunel was born in 1806, the son of a distinguished engineer. By his mid-20s, he had already designed the Clifton Suspension Bridge, an engineering marvel that still carries traffic today. His Great Western Railway revolutionized British transport. The broad-gauge tracks he specified allowed faster, more comfortable travel than any competitor could offer. Brunel thought big. The SS Great Britain, launched in 1843, was the largest ship ever built at that time. The first iron-hulled, propeller-driven vessel to cross the Atlantic. When Brunel endorsed atmospheric propulsion, he was applying the same bold thinking that had succeeded throughout his career. He saw a technology with genuine advantages and committed to developing it. His South Devon Railway was designed to showcase what atmospheric propulsion could achieve at scale. Larger tubes, higher speeds, longer distances between pumping stations. The pumping stations he designed were architectural statements. The Italianate towers were not just functional structures, but declarations of confidence in the technology's future. The total investment was substantial. Estimates suggest the atmospheric system cost around £400,000, equivalent to tens of millions in modern currency. Operations began successfully in September 1847. Speed tests exceeded expectations. The smooth ride impressed passengers. The absence of smoke and noise delivered on every promise. Then came the summer of 1848. The heat, the deteriorating leather, the rats, the escalating costs, the recommendation to abandon. Brunel accepted the decision without public protest. The man who had fought for his engineering choices throughout his career said nothing in defense of atmospheric propulsion. His silence remains one of the mysteries of Victorian engineering history. Was it embarrassment, or understanding that some battles cannot be won? Brunel died in 1859, just over a decade after the atmospheric railway's abandonment. He never revisited the technology, never published explanations or defenses. Britain and Ireland were not the only places where atmospheric railways operated. France built its own implementation. The Saint-Germain Atmospheric Railway opened in 1847. It connected the Paris railway terminus to the hilltop town of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. The route presented similar challenges to the Dalkey line, a steep gradient climbing from the Seine Valley to the town above. The atmospheric system handled the French gradient as smoothly as it handled the Irish one. Passengers were pulled up the hill by pressure differential, arriving at the summit comfortably. French newspapers reported favorably on the technology. Passengers appreciated the smooth ride and the scenic views undimmed by locomotive smoke. When the British atmospheric railways were abandoned, pressure increased on the French operation. The failure narrative spreading from London undermined confidence everywhere. The Saint-Germain line was eventually converted to conventional operation. Another working system eliminated. Another possibility foreclosed. The timing is noteworthy. French and British atmospheric railways rose and fell together, as if their fates were linked by more than just shared technology. The coal industry was international. The locomotive manufacturers had connections across borders. If atmospheric railways threatened these interests in Britain, they threatened them everywhere. The passenger experience deserves attention because the people who actually rode atmospheric railways left records of what they experienced. The smoothness was the most commonly noted feature. Steam railways jerked and jolted as pistons drove wheels in pulsing rhythm. Atmospheric railways glided. Passengers could read during their journeys. Books and newspapers stayed steady in their hands. Eyes could track across lines of text without constant adjustment. Writing was possible. Letters composed during atmospheric railway journeys survive in archives. The handwriting is steady, unlike the shaky script produced on steam trains. Conversation happened at normal volume. Passengers could speak to their companions without shouting. Social interaction was possible throughout the journey. The clean air inside the carriages impressed passengers accustomed to coal dust and smoke. Clothing stayed clean. Lungs stayed clear. The views through windows were unobstructed by locomotive smoke. The Devon coastline passed in full color. The scenery was part of the experience. Safety was another frequently mentioned advantage. No fire on the trains meant no risk of spark-caused accidents. No boilers meant no risk of explosions. Contemporary newspapers published passenger testimonials praising the atmospheric experience. These were genuine expressions of satisfaction. When the technology was abandoned, these satisfied passengers were not consulted. Their preferences did not influence the decision. Physical evidence of the atmospheric railway still exists today. For those willing to look, the traces are findable. The Star-Cross pumping station remains the most prominent surviving structure. Its distinctive tower rises above the Exe estuary, visible from passing trains. The building now serves as headquarters for a sailing club. The machinery is long gone, but the architecture remains. Windows positioned for monitoring equipment, doors sized for moving heavy machinery, the high ceilings that accommodated the pumping apparatus, all still visible. Other pumping stations survive along the former atmospheric route, some converted to residences, others serving commercial purposes entirely different from their origins. Archaeological surveys have documented finds of tube sections and valve fragments. The physical evidence aligns with the documentary record. Museums hold atmospheric railway artifacts, though rarely displayed prominently. The material culture of a suppressed technology scattered across institutions. For those who visit Devon, the traces are visible if you know what to look for. The pumping station buildings, the route of the former line, the landscape that silent trains once traversed. The pneumatic postal systems deserve extended examination because they prove conclusively that atmospheric propulsion technology worked reliably. London's pneumatic dispatch system began operation in 1863. It eventually expanded to link major postal facilities across the city. Capsules containing messages traveled through the network at speeds up to 35 miles per hour. The system worked reliably for decades. Paris took pneumatic post to another level entirely. The French system eventually included over 467 kilometers of tubes connecting facilities across the city. Messages could be sent across Paris in minutes rather than hours. The pneumatic post became integral to how the city functioned. The Paris system operated continuously until 1984. 118 years of daily service. Through 2 world wars, through the German occupation, New York's pneumatic mail system began in 1897. It operated until 1953. Over 50 years of reliable service. Millions of pieces of mail delivered pneumatically. At its peak, the New York system moved nearly a third of all first-class mail in Manhattan. This was not marginal technology, but central infrastructure. The pneumatic postal networks used identical principles to atmospheric railways. Pressure differential, tubes. The physics was the same. If atmospheric propulsion was fundamentally unreliable, how did pneumatic postal systems operate successfully for generations? The answer is obvious. The technology worked perfectly well when serving interests that did not threaten established powers. The Hyperloop represents the most ambitious modern revival of atmospheric principles. Let us examine recent developments. Elon Musk's 2013 white paper proposed vehicles traveling through low-pressure tubes at speeds exceeding 700 miles per hour. The concept attracted immediate attention. Here was one of the world's most successful entrepreneurs proposing something that sounded like science fiction. But it was not science fiction. It was an engineering proposal based on well-understood physics. The same physics that Victorian engineers had demonstrated. Virgin Hyperloop built a test facility in Nevada. In November 2020, they conducted the first passenger test. 2 employees rode in a Hyperloop pod. This was the first time humans had traveled in a Hyperloop vehicle, proof that the concept could safely carry passengers. Test runs have achieved speeds exceeding 400 kilometers per hour. The physics works exactly as predicted. The engineering challenges are real but solvable. Maintaining vacuum in long tubes, managing thermal expansion, ensuring safety at high speeds. The political challenges may be the most significant of all. Hyperloop threatens existing transportation interests, just as atmospheric railways did. Airlines, conventional rail operators, automotive interests, all have reason to view Hyperloop as competition. All have political influence to deploy. Whether Hyperloop succeeds will depend partly on whether the pattern established in the 1840s can be broken. The atmospheric railway story has direct parallels to clean energy debates happening today. The patterns are remarkably consistent. Solar power has been criticized for decades, using tactics the atmospheric railway would recognize. Emphasize problems. Demand impossible perfection. Fund doubt. Early solar panels were expensive and inefficient. Critics said they would never be viable. Meanwhile, conventional power received subsidies and externalized pollution costs. As solar costs dropped, the criticism shifted. Now it was intermittency. The sun does not always shine. A problem, certainly, but a solvable one. Wind power faced similar treatment. Electric vehicles encountered the same pattern: range anxiety, charging infrastructure, battery life. The goalposts kept moving. Meanwhile, the health costs of air pollution from combustion were rarely mentioned. The climate impacts of fossil fuels were minimized. The full costs were not compared. The asymmetry echoes the atmospheric railway perfectly. Clean alternatives held to standards that dirty incumbents never faced. Understanding this pattern helps recognize it when it appears. When criticism of clean technology seems disproportionate, ask who benefits from that criticism. The atmospheric railway teaches us that superior technology can lose to inferior interests. That technical merit is necessary, but not sufficient. This knowledge is power. It enables resistance to narratives designed to protect established interests at public expense. The atmospheric railway was real. It worked. Passengers loved it. It was faster, cleaner, and safer than the steam alternative. It was destroyed not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. Because it threatened interests too powerful to challenge openly. The official story of leather valves and rats is not entirely false, but it is incomplete, deliberately misleading, designed to justify a predetermined conclusion. The problems were solvable. Simple iron mesh for the rats, different materials for the heat. The Dalkey line proved these challenges could be overcome. The abandonment was a choice, not a necessity, a political decision dressed up as engineering reality. Whether the technology was Victorian invention or ancient recovery remains an open question. The evidence suggests something more complex than official history admits. The sophisticated architecture, the suspicious speed of development across multiple countries, the thorough destruction of evidence. These details demand explanation. The atmospheric railway represents a road not taken, a cleaner, quieter future that was possible in the 1840s and was deliberately prevented. The environmental costs of that decision accumulated across nearly 2 centuries. Respiratory disease, climate change, degraded quality of life for generations. We are still paying the price for Victorian choices about which technologies to permit. The trajectory toward our current environmental crisis has roots in those decisions. But the physics has not changed. The principles remain valid. The possibility is not closed, only delayed. Hyperloop may finally break the pattern, or it may encounter the same opposition that destroyed its Victorian predecessor. The lesson of the atmospheric railway is this: technology alone does not determine the future. Politics matters. Interests matter. The stories we tell about what is possible matter. If you understand this history, you can recognize the same patterns operating today. Clean energy facing skepticism that fossil fuels never encountered. Electric vehicles held to standards that combustion engines never met. The tactics that worked in the 1840s are still being deployed. The question is whether enough people will recognize them in time. The trains that ran on air are calling across the centuries. They remind us that better alternatives have existed before. That suppression of clean technology is not new. that the game is not always played fairly, that what we accept as historical failure may actually be deliberate destruction of threatening alternatives. Share this video if it changed how you understand Victorian technology and the forces that shape technological development. Subscribe for more hidden histories that challenge official narratives. Hit the notification bell so you will not miss what we uncover next. The atmospheric railway waited nearly 2 centuries for its full story to be told. Now you know what really happened to the trains that ran on air. Remember, the past is never truly past. Its echoes shape our present. Its suppressed possibilities still wait for rediscovery. The atmospheric railway ran on nothing but air and human ingenuity. It was silenced, but it was never truly defeated. And now you know its story. What you do with that knowledge is your choice, but knowing changes everything.